see.
There you go.
Rabbi Mori,
Hi, Rebbe.
can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can see you. I can hear you. The one thing I can't do is hug you. That's what
Oh,
I.
a virtual hug. I am so overjoyed and privileged, humbled really to be here um, with you today with my dear teacher, Rabbi Mori, Rabbi Menachem Creditor, for an episode of a rabbi and a Rebbe walk into a Zoom. and as folks trickle in, um, we'll go right into it. Um, I was reading an article about Olam Chesed Yibaneh, the anthem that you composed, and there was this moment that was captured of where you were singing this song inside APAC, and were recounting of how that, and it was also you later found out that actually the protesters outside of APAC were also singing that very song, and I read that, and that like crystallized for me so much of your rabbinate of on the inside, on the outside, the activism, the religious vision and thought, but very much in relationship with all of those worlds. And so I wonder if you would just tell us a little bit about, if you could bring us to that moment in time um, of singing that song, and then later uh, learning where it was sung.
Sure. No, I thank you for starting there. It really does. My heart was in so many places in that one moment, and I don't know if the article captured it, but I actually knew right as I started to sing that it was happening right outside too. It was Motzei Shabbos of the Shabbaton going into the policy conference, and I'd been asked to lead Havdalah for the group and to sing a little bit. So I sang Olam Chesed, and while it was being shared, the protesters outside said, "Why? How dare you stay inside? Why aren't you out here singing your song with us?"
Mm,
And my response was, "Don't you know we're all singing the same song?
mm,
Can't we, not can't we all get along?" I don't want to sound too naive about this, but if you want to be part of the change that you want to see in the world, I mean, it takes a deep kind of sacrifice, a deep kind of commitment to be present anywhere, because no group is going to 100% align with what I feel.
right.
So not all my needs will be met by the group that asks me to come. The question is, how do I show up as my whole self?
Mm,
And as a progressive agitator in sometimes conservative circles, or as a Zionist showing up in progressive circles. So the song for me it wasn't actually meant to be an anthem. It was meant to be a song for my daughter Ariel for Simchat
mm,
Bat, for her naming. That's when I wrote it. And I wrote it in response so many ways to 9/11 that she was born right after,
wow.
about a world that we needed. So that moment at APAC really does crystallize, like, you gotta dream bigger than the container.
Mm,
And if I think my container is all there is, I'm not dreaming anymore.
mm. Were you, did that come? Did that
I
type
lost
of?
you, Avram.
Can you hear me? Did that type of dreaming and visioning come naturally to you? Were you always that type of thinker?
My dear friend, I can see your beautiful face moving, but I can't hear your words.
Oh no, terrible. Can you hear me now?
Whispers of you, but you're coming in really quiet.
Oh no, that's terrible. Let's see. Any better?
Not much. Not much.
One moment.
Maybe without the headphones for a sec. Let's see what happens.
Mishanem Machom, Mishanem Mazal. Any luck?
Yeah, I'm hearing you a little bit, but not much better. What I'm going to do while we're doing this
Yeah.
is I think I'm going to log into our Zoom from my other device just in case that's on my side.
Okay.
All right, but
Um,
I'll ache to hear you. Go ahead.
okay. My question was, did that type of thinking of beyond the Kli, beyond the the vessel come naturally to you, or was that something you learned over time?
So that's a good question. I think, self knowledge is really tricky.
Mm-hmm.
And the ability to say, this is when I learned this is when I came to that realization. It's not clear how any of us gain the skills that we have. Um, I think that. Oh, there we go. We're gonna try it here. I'm gonna go mute.
Seder. Okay. I see you, but I cannot hear you.
Now you can hear me.
Now I can hear you and see you.
I'm gonna leave it from here, and I can
Okay.
hear you much better. Look what we did.
What would a Zoom interview be without some technical difficulty of some sorts?
Yeah, but talk about adaptive leadership. Check us out. Holy cow. So, your question is a really big one. How do we come to be the teachers, leaders, parents, mensches, I hope that we are. And I think it's such a collective thing. Malcolm Gladwell makes that point in Outliers. He says, if you are born in the right moment of the right year in the right circumstance, you can get the kind of training you need to ultimately, hopefully, make a big difference in the way that you are. So I'm both an insider and an outsider, and I don't know why. That's true in my life as a rabbi. I was born the son of a conservative rabbi. I am a conservative rabbi. I didn't want to be a rabbi, and then I started singing, so I said, oh, I can be a rabbi, that kind of rabbi. And I think that our ability to navigate the world is too complicated for us to name during our lifetimes. I could talk about how I got there, but some of it feels pretty accidental.
I was going to ask if you would tell us just a little bit, because you mentioned your father was a rabbi. Would you tell us a little bit about what your home life was like growing up?
Yeah, it was enchanted. It was enchanted, but I also had a child's experience of it, and so that's the kind of enchantment that my parents worked to provide for me. Um, it wasn't all that simple. It never is to be, communal rabbi. Um, but for someone who is so deeply involved in the health and welfare of the shul, which was his primary focus. Some of us are very concerned in the outside world, outward-facing rabbinate. His was very politically conscious, but really attuned to the life of the shul. He was home every morning, every night. And I gotta tell you, the model of father that I aim to be for my children is very much modeled on the father that I have, thank God. And my mother also, she saw herself not as buttress for her husband's life, but they definitely have always acted as a unit. So on the one hand, I wanted to emulate exactly the people that they have always been. On the other hand, I found my voice stifled by the kind of constraints that a shul would offer both politically and musically and spiritually. The more I learned, the more I recognized that, at least speaking personally, I needed a way to express myself beyond what I would be expected to do.
Mm.
Um, yeah, yeah. I actually, my senior sermon at JTS was on Parshat Vayera. It was on the Akedah, the binding of Isaac.
Mm.
And I was an infant at my father's senior sermon,
Wow.
where you didn't bring babies those days. And so he was sitting in front of a group he called Murderers Row. That was Finkelstein, Heschel, like you name
Wow.
them. They
Wow.
were all there. And he gave a talk on the four children for Pesach. And he
Mm.
said, who's my child going to be? And the way he tells the story, I let out a geshrai. I like screamed from the back of the room. And all of them turned around and said, who is that? And he said, that's
Wow.
my son. My senior sermon, he was present for. And
Mm.
my baby had just been born.
Mm.
And so there's a way, the content of what I gave was the resemblance between Avram and Yitzchak was unmistakable,
Mm.
but they were not the same person. And so um, I'm finding more and more, and I think we do this as we get older, that the echoes of my father in advance are pouring through me,
Mm.
for which I'm incredibly grateful. And the differences are also pretty manifest in ways that he has been so gracious in naming too.
Mm.
So growing up as the child of my parents has been nothing short of a miraculous blessing.
Wow. Um, how fortuitous, Parshat, to be talking about the Akedah um, in your senior sermon, as I think about so much of your life's work and activism, particularly around gun violence and the lives of children. Um, I mean, you mentioned some of those Gedolei Hador, those giants of our generation. But as you entered your rabbinate, did you imagine yourself involved in political pursuits?
Not at all. Not at all. And it's one of the ways that that I know that this is a calling for me.
Mm.
Is because I don't think I made conscious choices every time that led me to where I am.
Mm.
No matter how much I've tried to navigate life and my own work, sometimes it presented itself and I couldn't look away. When my it's not gun violence that began my work as an activist, and in fact, it was after rabbinical school. It was after I already had smicha, when I was an assistant rabbi in Sharon, Massachusetts, for a lovely shul. I was their first assistant rabbi, and I think for a while they decided that had been enough. So I was there for 5 years, and they didn't have an assistant rabbi for a little while. And while I was there, the fight for marriage equality in Massachusetts had begun. And in the conservative movement, the debates around LGBTQ smicha and marriage and equality and justice, I got involved in that stuff. And I didn't see it as strange. I just felt that it was an extension of everything that I'd been taught. And so there was someone asked me if I would add my name as a signature for an ad that was going to the Jewish paper, the Jewish Advocate. Massachusetts rabbis support marriage equality. I said, of course. But I didn't tell my senior rabbi, and I didn't ask the president of the shul. And as I wrote in a book recently, rookie mistakes. It pays to check in with your team, certainly with your supervisors. And the president, who had many complaints come from the shul that I'd become active in this way, came up to me and said, "I didn't know we hired an activist." And I looked at him and I meant it when I said, "What's an activist?" And little by little, I don't know how to say it. My broken heart kept on pulling me, not away from shul, but kept pulling me into the world beyond the walls of whatever building I called home. And that led me piece by piece to the different kinds of activism that ended up defining my rabbinate in many ways. In much the same way that I ended up going to Berkeley, California after serving in Sharon. And I was sitting in a meeting about our Hebrew school when the Sandy Hook massacre happened. And I got a call from a colleague saying, would you write a tefillah? Because I'd written a lot of prayer. Would you write a tefillah for this moment? So I did. And all of a sudden, I was in the middle of a conversation because I couldn't stop crying. And, we can talk about it if you'd like, but one thing led to another. And I found myself doing what I believe I'm supposed to be doing, but not in a way that I had anticipated it.
I'm struck by the way you describe honoring your heart, honoring your neshama's pull at you, and you describe it. It seems it doesn't seem politically calculated. It doesn't seem even though I'm sure those those orientations trickle in, but it seems like it stems from a very deep place inside of you. And I know I sort of asked this earlier, but I'm going to try and ask it again. Is that learned? Was that modeled for you? Was that like because that was your first gig out of rabbinical school. Um,
I Let me see if I can answer it. I don't know that it'll function as a well-rounded response, but it's a question that matters so much for anybody aspiring to a position of leadership. You know, I'll say this: my parents um, are very authentic people. They are who they are without any artifice,
mm,
which, I think, speaking with reverence for them, um, makes makes a person vulnerable in the world.
mm,
If I don't have a political agenda, I just am me wherever I go. You'll really know me,
mm,
and I hope that that's a good thing.
mm,
But to be really known and vulnerable in the world, I think the big blessing. I mean, I know that I wouldn't be where I am or who I am had it not been for the decisions of my parents, even though so much of where I am and who I am is also based up in my own agency.
mm,
But the biggest gift that they gave me was confidence that I could be my own authentic self wherever I went.
mm.
And I think the combination of authentic self and being self assured, which I don't always feel,
Right.
means that it probably is in me. Who I am is who I was born as. But were I not given the enormous gift of really of unconditional love and the sense that I was okay and
Hmm.
that I deserved love, um, I think all of that is why I I should think twice sometimes and don't. And it leads me to think that my voice, and I know I'm talking about me, but I mean this for others too. I don't think we're called to sacrifice our soul as we give to the world.
Mm,
I think we're called, like the song Bilvavi from Sefer Charedim, right? Ula korban akriv et nafshi.
mhm.
Like I'm supposed to bring my soul not as a thing that I should martyr myself for,
Right.
but the world needs us.
Mm,
So the question then is, who are you so that the us can be the strongest it can be?
mm. I love that framing. And so take us back to that synagogue meeting, or was it a Hebrew school meeting?
Yeah,
When
yeah. So it's not hard to go back there. You're the first person to ask me in a long time.
mm,
It's actually hard not to be there.
mm,
And there is a way in which that moment both signified the beginning of my actual rabbinate,
mm,
and also reduced me to my true ignorance when it comes to the world. I've had a few wake up moments that have shown me how little I actually know. That was one of them because my reaction was to the unfathomable gun violence that robbed the world of 26 teachers and students. And it led me, I was then invited by a dear friend of mine who's a pastor across the street, Pastor Michael McBride, to be part of a delegation to the White House to meet with Vice President Biden's team that was working on gun violence. And I was the only Jew on the signature at first, and I said, can we bring some other rabbis? And I mean, in that moment, in that meeting, I just couldn't continue the meeting, and I wrote an El Malay for Newtown, and I sent it. I don't wherever it went, and it went places, but I couldn't even see the screen. Like that's
mm,
so. And you weren't exactly asking this, but that meeting represented um, just represented a new phase of my being. I
Mm,
think part of me, part of me died, and part of me woke up a little bit, but not to the point that I actually knew what I didn't know, and I probably still don't. But when we went to the White House and Pastor McBride and I gathered a bunch, so I gathered 8 other rabbis, and we all went to the White House together. The only white people, as part of this 90 clergy delegation, the only white people were the rabbis.
mm,
And so when a facilitator asked us, we were intermingled, name the gun violence death that affected you the most. The rabbis, with the exception of my father, who had a very dear friend who was killed, um, the rabbis who were gathered said, I don't know one. And the pastors, and there were 2 imams that were there, looked at the facilitator and said, you want me to choose one?
mm,
And that was the beginning of my re-education.
mm,
When it came, not about gun violence, but obviously including that, but about humanity, about where I belong in the constellation of beings. Like, I thought that I was responding to gun violence, but I was really responding to 20 white children who were killed by a gun.
mm,
I wasn't thinking about the 3 Newtowns that happen every day in America and have happened every day in America before and since.
mm,
I wasn't thinking about the different kinds of gun violence between urban gun violence and 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 sort of mass shootings, which occupy such a small percentage. I wasn't thinking about racism. I wasn't thinking about, I don't know, but I was responding the way so much of America has and continues to, responding to mass catastrophe
mm,
without examining what violence represents in society.
mm,
So basically, one conversation, one heartbreak after another led me into this work.
mm,
And that's, similar to the question before, it's just where I think it's where we all are and where we don't want to be. And if we do our work, we won't be anymore.
mm. I'm s- the what it's such a humbling way of acknowledging your own learning edges, being in that auspicious space, in that room. And I'm wondering, because in many ways that propelled so much of your work and a coalition that you helped build, um, in specifically raising rabbis' antennas around gun violence. I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about what that work looked like. Uh, the supporters, maybe detractors, but what was it like to sort of raise an antenna for for colleagues, many of whom didn't have an N episode to choose from?
Yeah. Well, um, one of the things to name is that there are many other colleagues who have been involved in this work and predated my work by far, and whose lives were touched very deeply, very tragically. Rabbi Joel Masbacher, who is an incredible colleague in New York City, um, lost his father to gun violence and has been an incredible leader in organizing around this far before I did, and in ways I can't and don't want to imagine.
Mm,
Um, the responses were varied, as I think one might imagine. Without being too harsh at our Jewish world,
mm-hmm,
um, before Pittsburgh, way too often I would hear this, and I heard this when I was in the White House. I was so moved by the testimony that I was receiving, the information that was coming my way, and the brokenness and the commitment to healing the world, to saving lives through the faith injection into the body politic.
mm,
Right? I was so moved by all of this.
mm,
I was writing about it, I was blogging about it, and I kept hearing from colleagues what so much of the Jewish world said before Pittsburgh, which is it's their problem. And so the response on the one hand was vocal. We gained, I started a Facebook group called People Rabbis at first, which was the faith organizing group. It's now become Faith in Action. but it used to be called the Pico Network. And we had 200 or so rabbis. We put together a first collection of writings based on that conference. It was called Peace in Our Cities. Um, and it kind of stagnated after a while, right? The rabbis who cared were involved, and most rabbis at least weren't having the conversation publicly.
Mm-hmm.
Then around the time, I remember President Obama had a town hall meeting with Anderson Cooper. Um, and again, I keep on acknowledging my father's role in my rabbinate. My father was invited because of his role after Virginia Tech.
Mm.
Governor Tim Kaine invited my father to be part of the faith response for Virginia. So my father was going to be there. I said, what a great moment to rebrand the group. So let's just call ourselves, instead of Pico rabbis, let's go to the cause, Rabbis Against Gun Violence. And within 3 days, we had 1,200 rabbis who are now part of the effort. And I think the one big accomplishment that we had before Pittsburgh was that we broke the stigma around around talking about gun violence as if it was a them problem and not an us problem.
Mm-hmm.
I take a page from Paul Farmer, whose life as an immunologist is basically summed up like this. He said, if you think that a problem over there is not your problem, you should learn from germs. And I'm saying this in the middle of a pandemic. Right? The difference between them and you is just a matter of time.
Mm.
So he says you should save others because of a theory he calls pragmatic solidarity.
Mm.
Don't save them because it's the righteous thing to do if you don't want to. Meaning you should save them because it's the righteous thing to do. But if you're not going to save them for the right reason, save them because you want to save yourself. So for those reasons and others, I think we've managed to get more people's attention.
What a Torah for our time. I'm struck by that, the them problem versus our problem. I think of the rallying cry of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah, that the rabbis had the foresight to include on the day they would know most Jews would fill the pews, of the type of religion and Yiddishkeit and Judaism that God wants of us. And yet, like, these moments, these atrocious moments happen, and they captivate our attention and our heartache, and then life goes on, right? And there, I imagine the challenge of therein lies the challenge for the quote unquote the activists, right? Which is to sort of keep our antenna locked. But what you're describing feels like a more integrated, an integrated type of response. Meaning it's not because it's theirs, but it's davka because it's ours that it affects us and will affect us, if not today, tomorrow. And
look, I think you're pointing to something by using Yeshayahu as the text. I mean, he channels God and says, you think your piety is what I care about? You think davening with more fervor and ignoring what happens outside of your window?
Mm-hmm.
I have a dear friend, Glenn Maserano, who's one of the best laners I've ever heard. He belongs to multiple shuls in Berkeley, California, one of whom was the shul I served. And he gave the most intense talk I've ever heard on a Yom Kippur. He basically got up and just started crying. And he said, we should have a kisei. We have a kisei Eliyahu often, right? Elijah's chair, and we have it for moments of blessing, moments where we're asking for blessing, for brisses and stuff like that. He said, we should have a kisei Yeshayahu, an Isaiah's chair, and it should always be empty. No one's allowed to sit in it. He said, and if we did Yom Kippur right, every seat would be empty, because what are we doing here? If you think that this isn't about the world being saved, and you think the way that we do things in this room, in this shul, in this whatever, this is going to do it, God must be so disappointed with us. And I think you're right. It's an integrated thing. The Torah, the prophets, they don't care about you keeping kosher. I mean, they might, but they don't say that. They care about homeless people. So how can I call myself a good Jew if all I care about is nusach?
Would you talk a little bit about your relation, your own theology, your own sort of the place of God for you in this type of work?
Ask me light ones, man.
Okay.
No, no, no. As we know of each other, neither of us is shy with stuff that is meaningful.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I grew up with Uncle Moishi and singing Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, and had no idea what I was singing and never
Mm,
really thought about it. I didn't assume Hashem was there. I just didn't assume anything about anything. I just, went with the flow. And the kind of things that made me start thinking harder, I had a dear, dear teacher, a Rebbe of mine, Rabbi Neil Gilman, shattered my theology. That's one of the things he did in his classes at JTS. He just wanted to like rip your theology apart. He had to think harder. He wasn't always involved in the putting it back together thing.
mhm,
I was very lucky that he was tolerant of me so that we could work on it together.
mhm,
Um, but if I were to describe the God of my childhood, it's a God who was all good, all present, all knowing.
mm,
And that's the basis of a lot of people's theology. And the last thing I want to suggest while I continue speaking is that my theology should debunk yours. God is too often used as a proof or as a disproving power, and I'm not interested in that. The God I believe in is only my way into the infinite, and there's got to be room for others. So part of what happened to me as I started reconstructing my own theology was the recognition that my truth doesn't have to be yours. And if I think my truth has to be yours, that's avodah zarah, that's idol worship.
mm,
That's not loving God.
mm,
And probably the most pivotal moment in my theological becoming was 9/11. I was, this conversation, man. When we touch reality, when we really touch meaning, it's really hard to stay calm.
mm, mm,
I appreciate this with you. Both in our private conversations and in this one, it's the right kind of overwhelming. Um, my daughter was born March 31st, 2002. So we were expecting her, and I was a senior rabbinical student in Manhattan. And my sister was an EMT in Manhattan. And thank God she's okay. A rabbi, a chaplain in the Navy. She's a hero. She's awesome. My great aunt, Aleh Shalom, lived on Bethune Street down in the village. And my grandfather lived in Queens, Aleh Shalom. And I couldn't reach anybody.
mm,
I couldn't reach my wife. I couldn't reach my sister. I couldn't reach my aunt. I couldn't reach my grandfather. And we were the senior rabbinical students, and we just sat like everybody did, watching the towers again and again. And the people who hijacked those planes were sure about God, and that's not God. And I don't think I made a conscious decision, but it's absolutely, it's trembling inside of me as I speak it. I refuse to be sure of God ever again.
mm,
And that kind of brokenness, I think, is where my theology begins. That if I truly love God, I have to immerse myself with all of God's images,
mm,
with my neighbor's welfare. Combating violence is a way of loving God, right? I had been davening my whole life, but never heard the word, Ohavei Adonai Sinu Ra. If you love God, you hate evil.
mm,
I can't keep my body still if I hate evil. And then the challenge for me, which you weren't asking about, or maybe you were, is because of my fervent reactive theology, I guess, or responsive theology, I can become very sure of myself even in this position.
mm.
And so then how to basically take a theological Hippocratic oath. Through my function as a religious leader, I vow to do no harm. So,
Mm.
all the other ways that people who are deeply sensitive and holy probably describe God. I also feel, I look at my children's eyes and I'm brought to tears, and I look at my wife and I wonder how I'm so blessed, and I'm sitting with you, I'm looking out a window, like I'm looking at the clouds. Why do they exist? So it's all part of that for me. But I guess as a person, it's all true. As a rabbi, I think that my love of God demands that I act the way that I do.
Mm, mm. Thank you for that. Can I ask you some questions about your children?
Sure. I might answer
Because
some of them.
I'm thinking about the songs that you grew up singing, right? Whether the Uncle Moishi refrain to the Olam Chesed Yibaneh that your kids and their friends sing and get sung, and the imagery of looking out the window, right, in the world that we see or that we scroll through on our feeds, and I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about what it's like. Your children are teenagers. They're and
Four of the five of them are teenagers. One of them is turning 10.
okay. um so I'm always thirsty for Tati Torah, for parenting Torah. I often wonder what the Talmud would have looked like had the rabbis been changing diapers. And I'm so curious if you would let us. I mean, you do let us in often in in your posts and in your writings about what it is to father for your kids. But I'm wondering if you would tell us a little bit about what it's like to sort of um, share that. I don't want to say brokenness, but like the vulnerability, the sort of like the authentic, like honesty of what it, because it's something I aspire to be able to say confidently, I don't know, to my children, but to do it in a way that they still feel loved, they still feel supported. Does this make sense at all? What my the
This is the question. This is one of the Dvarim Shalomdim B'Rimo Shel Olam.
hmm,
This is one of the questions that's at the highest heights of the world, and because it's so high, it's kind of inaccessible. Like, I appreciate you asking me the question, but I think we should be, we should be in a support group together.
hmm.
Abbas, Abbas who try.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
Sign me up.
No, I've been in the club for a long time. You're a
Okay.
member. I think that really, I think the answer is we're. You asked about me, so I'll just answer about me. I'm doing my best. Um, and parenting during a pandemic is a different amplification of your question.
Hmm.
Um, one of my children was a senior. The one Ariel, for whom I wrote Olam Chesed, was a senior in high school at the Lafel School um, when the pandemic broke out, and so she made it back. But the end of her senior year ended, and now she hopefully will go on a gap year, a nativ in Israel, and we're holding out hope. How to be with her in this? One of my children is going to 10th grade, and he just needs to run around, and all the hoops were taken down from all the public parks, and I just want him to be able to play,
Mm-hmm.
you know because I've been blessed with a second chance at love. So my wife Neshama and I have 5 children. Because of that, we each brought in an incoming 8th grader into our world,
Hmm.
and they each are different people, and how they navigate this world. And our youngest, who's entering 5th, also, I mean, I said the 14-year-old needs to run. The almost 10-year-old really needs to run. Um, and the core of your question, if I heard it right, or at least the way my heart felt it most deeply, is how to not know in front of my child.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's really hard. You know, I think I remember learning this from. I learned this from Danny Gordis a long time ago. He was doing work that had him reading Plato, And Plato says in the Republic that the way to perpetuate the institutions of society is to teach children the myths they will one day need to unlearn.
Mm.
Now, I don't know enough about Plato, and Danny and I are friendly, but I wouldn't speak for him. What I would say for me, applying that idea is if I want my children to grow up stable in a shaky world, I have to reassure them about things that aren't quite true. And so, I remember I had a really dear friend named John Gallinson in Berkeley. We were preschool dads together, and he got sick and died very quickly.
Mm.
And we ended up having a lot of conversations, all the preschool parents. What do we tell our children? And I don't know that any one of us know, or any of us, but the experts that came to talk to all of us, of which I was not one, said, the way that you answer your child is you say, it is really sad that John died, but I'm okay and I'm going to be okay. And you and I know we can't promise that, but I'm going to promise it to my children. I'm going to do everything in my power to make it true too.
Mm.
But I think our job is to reassure our children despite our doubts, and as they grow, to share more and more of our humanity, because inevitably we don't need to be active to share our humanity. They're going to tell us they see it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think we all grow up, and this is a theological thing, this is a parenting thing. We grow up seeing how complicated things are, but we don't have to know that when we're 5.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I really do think about my children and the way they are on social media and what they're exposed to. They know much more at their ages than I did. And I can't protect them from the world, but I think a parent's job is to find a way for our children to be strong in a world that makes that urgently necessary.
Mm. Well, I thank you for modeling that. I was so struck by the song that you and your oldest recently composed together. So beautiful.
I told her this morning I tried singing it by myself.
Yeah.
It didn't quite work.
Yeah.
It was a moment where, like, when you really create with your child,
Mm.
what is it? What is it to try to do that on your own? And the
Mm.
answer is pale, really.
Mm. Did you grow up playing music and writing poetry? I mean, your writing is prolific. There are multiple anthologies of your writings, but also of poetry. And so, was that always a passion of yours, or was that a later discovery?
It was later, and uh, and I don't know quite when it began. It Sharing some but not all of this truth. When I began the work of recalibrating my life, that's when that all started happening. And I didn't quite know, and I'm still not sure that it's poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I just know that I have to let it out.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times where I look back at the poem that I've sent into the world and I said, how could I have shared that with
Mm-hmm.
anybody?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so revealing, it's so raw. Um, if I sang as a child. My sisters and I would sing the entire Joseph soundtrack to our parents whenever they would let us. And my parents are both singers, so I had music in my life,
Yeah.
but I didn't create per se until it started happening inside of me, and that was bec- well, probably was because a Jewish a cappella group changed my life. Pismon from JTS in Columbia
Mm.
sang in my shul when I was 15. That's why I went to JTS as an undergrad, so I could sing in the a cappella group. And once I was in the a cappella group, I was singing. Once I was singing, I started arranging. And once I started arranging, it was always in my
Mm.
head. So again, it's sort of like, did I choose did I choose any of this?
Mm-hmm.
And I hear Aviva Zornberg teaching. She says the phrase "Nora alila" from Ne'ilah, the davening at the end of Yom Kippur, that it's a tangled skein. You can't really
Mm-hmm.
see where the strings led.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I know that once we start this kind of conversation, my brain's all over the place saying, "Oh, I got this from there, and this came from here."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, I was Ruth Messenger wrote on one of your books that like what you do is like you slice open your heart and then let the and we get to see, we get to read, we get to hear and witness that. And if that strikes me as so true. And I'm wondering, as you think about your rabbinate, right? Like what are like where did you ever have the voice? I'm asking for a friend that says, right, like, well, that's not, those aren't the pieces that a rabbi doesn't do, right? Whether it's whatever it might be, the music, the poetry, the political, or how did you come to the place of knowing that no, this was actually what God wanted of you, that you felt called to do, as you talk about being a calling.
Yeah, this is maybe the most precious conversation I can remember having
Mm,
for a very long time, Avram. I'm so touched by your question.
thanks, Menachem.
Um, I'll answer in a slightly funny way like this. My birthday a few years ago, um, so today is my daughter Raya's birthday. When it was my birthday a few years ago, she said, "Abba, I'm going to give you a present." I said, "Okay, what are you going to do?" She said, "I'm going to imitate you."
Mm.
So we're sitting in the sukkah, and she looks at me. She goes, "You're so beautiful." And then she pretends to be crying,
All
and
right.
I share it A because I'm so in love with my daughter,
Yeah.
um, but B because
Mm.
I maybe I'll continue thinking about this and develop it over time. Maybe I can best answer the for now part of your question. If it makes me cry with beauty or pain, I'm supposed to be paying attention to it.
Mm.
And there are conversations that any rabbi has of any kind, be a base Rebbe or be a conventional shul rabbi or a scholar in residence at a federation or whatever role we serve. Some parts of it are just nourishkeit, right? Like the conversation about should we get these gefilte fish balls or those?
Mm-hmm.
That is not going to change the world, and you don't need rabbinic input for that kind of a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, some of us really want to control the environment in which we serve. So your question about, have I had a voice in me saying, this is where your rabbinate should be and this is where it shouldn't be? Yeah. Sometimes to my professional complicated life, because there are things that I really do feel I am called to do as part of a we, like we're called to pay attention to. And those are not always the priorities of the community that employs us or that looks to
Mm-hmm.
us for guidance. And I've been wrong sometimes. I've been wrong when I think, Shiva is being covered by this other rabbi with whom I work. I'm going to focus on this and not go there. And I've let somebody down pretty severely because it's actually not about what am I called to do. It's about where am I needed, which is not always an internal emotional truth.
Mm.
Sometimes there is a communal need that should obligate me, that because of my heart's, sort of intensity, I sometimes can't hear.
Mm.
So I think the question is a really good one, and I haven't answered it to the satisfaction of others, and some of those others really matter, not only because my professional welfare is bound up in their assessment, but because maybe they were right. Maybe the quieter ways that we can rabbify um, are just as holy as the as the
Mm.
piercing ways.
Mm. Mm. I'm thinking about, as I don't know what it was. I think Jewish privilege was trending on Twitter just day or two, and I'm thinking about what it is to be in touch with our own our own people's, you know, 1,000-year history of persecution and suffering, and the context of, the political power, um, that 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 some Jews currently have, and but also to the spiritual Torah of what you're talking about, of honoring this inner voice.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about that mosaic, of given the moment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Well, each of those, each facet of the question requires its own kind of unpacking. So I'll do my best to be brief about it, but this is the conversation of our time. This is the conversation, both internal to the Jewish community and as global citizens. We need to be deeply mindful of the privilege that we embody. And the best way for me to think about it out loud is just to talk
Mm-hmm.
individually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I just finished this book. I was waiting for the moment to hold it up. This is my recommendation of book for this whole talk here. Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Ta-Nehisi Coates is among the most brilliant interlocutors of our day. Both the speaking as a black man, speaking as a journalist, speaking as a father. This book was written for his son. It wasn't originally crafted that way, but then he reformatted as a letter to his child. I've never had to have the talk with my children, with my sons, about what to do if a police officer talks to you. The most important way that I can begin any response to the important question you asked is to recognize, and I've said this a lot recently, that whereas throughout our Jewish history, Jews have not been quite white, with the privilege overtones, the class overtones, the social overtones that white has come to mean. But in America, I'm definitely not black. Both of those truths have to be held. I mean, Heschel said, right, a prophetic soul is one who holds God's truth and human's truth in one hand at one time at all times.
Mm.
Um, so for me to begin to think about privilege, I have to name my own. And because of the public role that I play, I have to name my own in a way that can be heard.
Mm.
The most communicable way for me to do that is to acknowledge what I haven't had to do. And whereas here I am in a pandemic, in isolation, just like everybody else, I've had students who say, I feel so vulnerable, but they're saying so from a beautiful home in the Hamptons where they've gone so that they didn't have to be in Manhattan right now, which means we are all vulnerable. That is all emotionally true. But if I'm okay and some other, quote, essential worker is doing the work to keep me alive, that is absolutely the starting point to understand my own privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Jewish privilege. I mean, I'd love you to explore out loud what that question means. Like, what does it mean to think about Jewish privilege, given that part of what I need to face as a white Jew, not a Jew of color, as a white straight man, what does Jewish privilege mean to you?
Totally. You know, um, I think about this often. I was talking with a baser recently, and this was more around the time of the riots and protesting were in full flow and heat. But he was describing the fear that he had of simply go. He happens to be a Jew of color, lives in the Bronx, and was describing the fear that he has of simply going outside to go to the grocery store. And every time I think about that, I'm overcome because that's a fear that I don't know. I just simply don't know. I might have a fear at time, depending on my circumstance of wearing my yarmulke in specific places, but I don't have a fear of walking outside to go to the supermarket. in the same visceral type of way that that this young man has. And so, when I think about Jewish, I mean, I think it's Judaism is the lens in which I see the world. So it's a constant invitation into, as you described, to sort of to reevaluate, to reflect on my own circumstance.
Well, what's interesting in the way that you just did that is, right, Judaism is the framework through which you experience the world, but the friend that you were speaking about is a Jew also.
Correct.
So it's actually, when it comes to the question of privilege, Jewishness is only a facet of my identity.
Mm,
The challenge of privilege is recognizing that there are parts of my identity I don't have to be conscious of, and because I
fair.
don't have to be conscious of them, that's privilege.
Right. Right.
Jews have not, occupied privileged space in history, and the real, what a weird thing. I mean, I'm imagining our ancestors, my ancestors from
Yeah.
Minsk, from Belarus, Jewish privilege.
Right.
Oh my God, their response would be like to
Right.
fall on the floor and say, "Who do you
Right.
think you are?"
Right.
Jewish privilege.
Right.
And there's truth to that too. It's a real question, to see, I say this with some trepidation. Is America the great experiment? Is America different? When white supremacists holding tiki torches in Charlottesville say Jews will not replace us, they're of course horrific, and they're also only parroting the protocols of the elders of Zion.
Of course.
The idea that we will replace white power with people of color, as if social and racial justice isn't a holy imperative. There are so many ways in which we're only beginning to unpack the notions of privilege and the Jewish identities that inform our experience, the trauma that makes me think I'm always under threat, even when I'm not.
Mm, mm.
And then the rejection of history as if I'm not vulnerable. Go ahead, I'm waiting.
No, I'm mindful of the time, and this question, it'll be my last one to interrupt us, but because how can we interrupt this conversation? But given all that, given all given all that, right? And here you are. We were talking about this earlier briefly of how you've spent your weekday mornings every day for the past 20 or so weeks, or if not more, of of leading a virtual congregation, right? Of being of service. I'm talking about the online gatherings that you've been hosting, part of the UJA. But where, given the storm of a moment, where do you go for and storm of uncertainty and fear, and where do your spiritual reserves dwell? Where do you go for nourishment?
What a right question. All right, so I want to note you're asking me at 12:56 today. But if you ask me at 2:56 today,
Okay.
or if you ask me at 9 o'clock tonight, or at 8 o'clock this morning, we are in a moment. We were talking before about parenting and how to communicate uncertainty. We're in a moment where uncertainty is ubiquitous. If you're not feeling vulnerable, you're not paying attention.
Mm.
So so I'll answer ish. I go to my children for reassurance. I just want to hug them, and they don't realize the anchor in this world they are for me.
Mm.
They watch this video, they'll know.
Mm.
And as they listen to me over our lives together, they'll know more and more. I go to my wife just for her quiet presence. And having done enough work, thank God for the work of therapists to help people like me. To remember that the external affirmation that I just named is only part of how to be okay, and in fact not the essential integrated way to be okay.
Mm.
To be an integrated person, this hand on this chest needs to also be enough.
Mm.
The way that my children are my biggest treasure and my wife is, again, a priceless blessing and more. I'm enough. And when I put my hand on my heart, I'm also touching God, which means that my hand is also reassuring me in God's name.
Mm.
You know, I wish I could say I daven as regularly as I preach. You know, I do daven often, but nothing is spontaneous. I think the spiritual reserve that I turn to in my moments of greatest need, um, to be healthy, it's got to be this beginning. To be real and to be honest, it's all those things.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I even forget to reach out. And those are the moments where I don't have a good answer. In this
Mm-hmm.
moment, I got you.
Mm.
And it's not a line, it's not hyperbole. Real friends. I mean, I feel your presence with me in a visceral way. I have felt it when I convene with Eric Wilson, CEO of UJA. We convene our staff every Friday. When I watch my colleagues leave the screen, I begin to grieve. And that tells me that when they're there, they're there. So, all of it, all of it, all of it, Avram.
Thank you so much,
It was so
Menachem. I'm so grateful to have had the past hour with you.
me too.
Um,
Me too.
onward, onward. Chazak
Amen.
v'amatz.
Amen. You too. Love your kids.
Much love. Bye.
Avram. See you soon.
Take care.